move into how do we then, once we have decision tree of which countries we want to invest into, how do we start to actually evaluate those countries from a very deep dive basis? And that's what you're going to be doing in terms of looking at that. In terms of assignment number 1, it seemed to me that some folks here didn't quite get some of what was going on. So what I am proposing, since also I missed a class, is if we want, whoever wants to, you can email me and I will set up a class time, not class time, but a time for all of us to get together to go through that in much more detail, so that any questions or issues we can address and pull out and make sure that everybody really gets it. Because if we don't get that part, it's going to be difficult going forward. Okay? So just email me and then we'll find dates that everyone could, even on a weekend, I'll make myself available to do that. Okay? So let's go through the assignment number 2 and then we'll jump right into the other one. Unless anyone has any questions. Okay, all good? Okay, so I gave you actually the table of contents, in essence. Thinking about, remember we're going from, we always go from big to small in any kind of presentation. Think about the macro pieces, what's happening in the big picture, and then move into the country specifics and then the real estate specifics. Okay, and how does that country fit into the paradigm of the larger world as we sort of know it? So we say here that it is a comparative macroeconomic analysis, because we do need to think about it where it fits in the scheme of things, the rest of the world. And we're looking at quantitative and qualitative. So if you know that there is an election coming up, that's not quantitative, that's qualitative. But that should be definitely brought forward into your discussion. Okay? But then we do need to look at how is the GDP, where is the GDP, what is the GDP growth looking like, things of that nature. So both you want to really cover, make sure you cover both. You're telling people a story. And then you need to have a conclusion in terms of what your investment thesis would be for that country. Assume that you're making a recommendation to invest, all of you, okay? And then what you will need to do is within that schematic of that country, tell us, CalPERS Investment Committee, what you would do in that country. What is the best idea that you have for that country, okay? Even if you think it's awful, still, go there. So this is what's really key here. You're going to be graded on your presentation of data, be graded on your presentation, but primarily on your analysis and interpretation of that information. It's easy to just throw back data points, but it's for you to tell us, what do those data points mean? What is your interpretation of that? What is your forecasting? Because remember, real estate investing is for the next, say, decade. So you need to be able to interpret that data into what does that mean to an investor going forward. Okay? So, and I put you into teams. Hopefully that's okay. I know sometimes it's a little bit difficult. Let me say this. I've seen prior classes where it's obvious one person did the work. Don't do that. Because I'll come back to you and say, I need to see that so-and-so also participated in this. Okay? And I'm pretty good at deciphering it. So that's, yeah.
So are we in the same group? We supposed to do the work together?
Yes, okay, yes, a good question. So you're submitting one paper, one presentation from the two of you, and you present it to, and you also both need to be presenting as well. Okay? And you need to create it together. Maybe, you know, one person does 2 parts, the other person does the other parts. One thing that happened 2 terms ago was that someone left it to the other person to do a certain portion of it, and they hadn't checked. And then they got up and they saw, like that day, that, oh, I don't agree, it's all wrong, essentially. So you need to be collaborative, is what I would say in this, and be sharing the work as you're doing the work. Okay? It's pretty basic. As I said, I gave you the table of contents. These are the things. Now it's not, you don't have to use this exact table of contents. I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, but these are the types of things that you need to be thinking about, what you need to be covering. Not every single one of them will be relevant, important, but you need to know this country that you're doing.
This is due next week.
So you guys are gonna be presenting to us, and we'll and I'm going to time it next time. I'm sorry, last time I apologize about that. So next time I'll watch. So we'll be presenting to the committee, and then we will all be pushing into you to say yes, no, maybe, why, what did you say this for, I don't believe you on that, whatever, okay? But this is the format of what. So even go back to the different sessions that we've had in terms of the kinds of materials that you would be thinking about that would be helpful for you in presenting this. So thinking about investing into a country, foreign country, to a US pension fund for the first time, what do they need to know? Think of yourself. If you're sitting in that committee, what would you need to know? Okay. Any other questions?
It's a paper and a presentation, or just, okay.
So in terms of do a PowerPoint, so you can get up here and do that. You know, it's up to you. There's no right number of slides. But I'd be hard pressed to think you could do it in less than, I don't know, 10, 15 slides, somewhere in there. And it's interesting, because you're really getting to learn about a country from, you're really doing a deep dive. Okay? Good? And just email me, whatever, during the week, if you have questions, fine. Okay? Good to go? Okay, so that you have your teams. And I'm so sorry. It was just luck of the draw.
I know.
Although, so it gave you one of the smallest countries in terms of just size of the country.
So will it be hard to find information, or will it be like?
No, it's there.
It's France.
You know what? If you have a hard time, let me know.
Okay, no.
Yeah.
Okay.
But also, so you have to depend on anybody. It's good and bad and everything.
It's fine.
Right, sorry.
It's
I
fair.
seriously, I was like, oh no.
No problem.
So I just sort of like, maybe because you wrote a K in the middle of it.
It's okay.
Okay, all right, good sport. All right, so underwriting countries. Okay, I've mentioned to you the economist intelligence unit. Probably can't get access to it because it's expensive, but this is how a journal looks at analyzing the country, and these are all the different points that they look to cover. So it's the same thing. So I'm saying to you, I'm leading you through this, right? Take note, but take note that this is what we're looking for. And these are one of the things we've discussed, right? Liquidity, GDP growth, sovereignty risk, fiscal balance, income levels. All of these are types of sort of the macroeconomic pieces that you want to touch upon. So if you did just, if you just looked at the headlines and did just one sentence, what are the highlights of that? You're starting to get yourself there. relative country risk. Now again, these go back a ways, but because I don't have access to EIU anymore. But so you're looking at minimum risk, maximum risk, in terms of how they rank them for instance, political stability and a measure of credit quality. So you also want to see trends for your particular country, right? You want to see what's been happening. Is all of a sudden everything on the upswing? Is it on the downswing? Where is it in its life cycle, if you will? So I think that's really very important to see, to be able to judge. Because you're all of a sudden just like helicoptering in, and what do you know, right? So you need to look expansively in time-wise, in terms of that. Urban population growth. Again, what we're projecting, right? We're looking at where things are going, how they're going to be in the next 10 years or so. And we're going to get into in a minute into the different types of cities there are out there and where your different countries fit into that schematic of how people now are viewing cities and therefore countries. Middle class population growth, right? We always look for that kind of opportunity to invest in where there's a dynamic change happening. So if there's already, you know, you look at a place like the US, and we've been talking about somewhat stagnant because the growth has already happened. So you're not going to get the returns in the US that you would in a lot of other markets. But looking for middle class growth, has it happened already? Is there still a lot of room to go or grow? Or is it already, or has it happened at all? And maybe it won't happen. And then what is the government doing to try to help that or not help that? So these are the kinds of things you need to understand, see whether or not it's a place to be investing into. Working age population, we spoke about Japan. Who did I give Japan to? Yeah, okay. That's a big one for you guys, obviously. Actually, you want a clue? Go on the Japan Central Bank's website. And the chief economist just gave a speech, which I listened to at the Japan Society, and it's on that website, and there's some good information on that. So, working age population, where is the growth going to be coming from? Is that something that's key in terms of offices? Are you going to be investing into offices if you know that, well, the office employment population is going down? Like, hello, that's why we look at demographics. Types of cities. So there's a lot of new, I'll call it social science. Yeah, go ahead.
Do companies wanting to go public, wanting to list themselves on IPO? I bring this up because of Aramco wanting to go public in the Tokyo markets rather than NYC or London. Do they do the same type of due diligence of where they want to list themselves?
Well, I want you to answer that question.
I'm sure they should. They do.
Well, what are they looking for? So what is their goal?
Again, strong fiscal policy so that so that their interests in terms are protected.
What else? Somebody else.
I think from looking where the list, they're probably less worried about population growth as they are in terms of like who could impose kind of political control or financial control, ease of investments to kind of a global population, and you know they're situated in Asia, so Americans can still invest in the Tokyo stock market.
Fiscal policy.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. What else? You. You. You.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Any thoughts?
Sorry.
That's
Right.
okay. All right. Who else?
Yeah, stable economy. I mean, they're
But what if you look? Okay, let's look at WeWork.
right.
What was WeWork trying to do?
IPO,
Right. Why?
raise money.
Hello. Right. Thank you, Emma. Right. Exactly. They wanted to raise money. So what are they going to look at? They're going to look at per capita income, right? They're going to look at liquidity. So they're going to look at what is the stage of the stock market, what is the stage of the bond market, just looking at just what's around and available. They want to see there's enough capital out there. Where is the capital coming from to then invest into buying the stocks? So it's a different kind of analysis, but they're going to use bits and pieces of what we're talking about.
Like the macroeconomic,
Right, but they want to know that people are going to buy this stuff. So they're really going to be looking at what's been happening with the stock market, most likely. And then where is it going? And but you're right, fiscal policy is going to be a big thing that they're going to be considering. And also then the currency issue, right? That's going to be very critical to them as well. Being able to bring the currency out of that market, back to their home market. So you always have to look at what is the goal, what is someone trying to accomplish. And from that, you'll be able to determine what is it they need to know. Who knows?
Yeah.
Okay. So I started to say here is there's a social science that's been booming these days in terms of evaluating and looking at cities. And how do we evaluate cities? Because what a lot of researchers are thinking is that it's a different kind of city that's starting to happen to grow up. And so they're coming up with cute names and patterns, and you look at again like a WeWork. WeWork is the largest private tenant, picking on them, the largest private tenant in both New York and London. And what is their business model? It's to lease to entrepreneurs, people like us, right? Or like you, yes, okay? So that's a very different analysis or credit situation than what most landlords are typically, what banks lend for. Like, let's say, put myself in, we don't have any real credit, and what credit did WeWork really have? The credit was based on their tenancy who had no credit. And it's a much more open floor plan and all sorts of things like that. So that kind of change in dynamism of the worker, the employee, and finding workers now. What's our unemployment rate here in the US now?
I guess it's
It's like three something percent. It's the lowest it's been in like 50 years or some crazy number like that. So that's a critical piece of what a business looks for. Remember when Amazon was looking to where they should do their headquarters #2? That was one of the most biggest pieces of the puzzle for them to figure out where they're going to get employees from. So what did they look at? They looked at universities, see where the brain trust was going to be coming from, and where there were millennials, huge populations of people that would be working for them. So it's that kind of different dynamism that is shifting how everyone's evaluating different cities and how they operate. So what this is from JLL, and I'm biased, but they do a good job. They broke it down into established world cities, new world cities, and emerging world cities. And you can read it at your leisure, but you can start to see that there's different types of motivating factors and what's happening in these different parts of the world that are capturing these kinds of breakdowns. And so here are some different cities that fall into those categories. But just to be aware that because of these kinds of changes of occupancy, also people working at home, how is that going to be affecting the whole office marketplace, right? So all of these factors, this is in 2015, come into play when thinking about where are we going to be investing and where are these different cities sitting. So the big seven, the most sort of stayed, tried and true of the ones that you'd expect, London, New York, Paris, Hong Kong, Tokyo, Singapore, and Seoul, are so the critical foundation, and then it all comes out after that. But we start to look at influencers, Kyoto, Milan, Miami. Now we're starting to talk about second and tertiary markets. So as an investor, you're looking at opportunities for growth, right? So you're probably not going to look at the big seven in terms of where to invest. You're probably going to start to look at where are some of these other types of cities that are having opportunities for growth. Okay? So here's, I just pulled this out. So this is 2006, well, they did it since 2017 for now. So here's your big seven, and then you have the global contenders. And, you know, you're starting to see more European and some Asian cities in there too. And it's interesting that London, so we've been talking about Brexit and all the influence of political blah, blah, blah. Makes us look like that wasn't really quite accurate. Or in this instance, and why is that? Why do you think that is? London really led the pack here. And we've spoken about that before. Brenda, any ideas?
I think because it's such an international city that even if it's cut off from the Eurozone, it's still
Right.
attracting capital from all over the world.
Right. Look at the location, look at all the immigration that it's had, the kinds of, all the businesses that are there. It's a central financial hub for Europe. So, in spite of, and people look at that and say, oh, it's a great opportunity to buy, actually. So sometimes, so we need to look at these things like a Brexit, obviously, but then you need to look behind it and see what exactly is happening or not happening, make up your mind from there. Okay, so this is more of the same. Bless you. So also, and so here I added this because we always need to look at, when we're looking at these kinds of charts and rankings and things, what were they using? What were the different metrics that they were thinking about? Because we might have a different view. So here they looked at global flows, market size, infrastructure, platform talent, innovation, and soft power. So global flows means how much capital has been going in and out of the country from not necessarily just that country, but from other sources. So, and here's just a good summary. When you're thinking about your countries and the major cities that you would be investing into, you can sort of start to plot where it is based on what we're looking at here. Like what are the, and so if you think about it, and actually here, wait, something I wanted to show you on, actually on Japan. Well, all right, but the pretty colors. Okay, go back to this one actually even. So here we have it's cute, so I thought one of them. No. Well, point being that, so a place like Japan, how many places is a foreign investor really going to be investing into? So you have Tokyo, obviously, right? And then you have, and we're always saying that, you know, you need a certain density of market, of investment opportunities, of investors, of free-flowing capital to be able to make sure you can get in and get out. So if you look at your country, there are only going to be maybe, let's say, 2 to 4 cities that would really make sense, right? Because you're not going to go to, I don't know, Timbuktu someplace that doesn't really have any marketplace. So that's why you need to start looking at the cities within the countries that you've been given to figure out where exactly you would be going.
What does soft power mean?
So No question, I'm not really interested, sure. I think it's probably, I don't know, any guesses from anybody?
I think it's the so the US had a lot of soft power, the influence they have on other countries, backed by a strong economy and a strong military power. So basically, getting
So
countries to
influence,
use
or
influence
influencer.
without actually having to engage
Okay.
militarily. I
So-
think I'm not entirely essential there.
So they have, so under New World Cities, we do have influencers. So maybe that's a good guess. Yeah, and regional influence and their roles linked to hosting.
I found the definition.
Oh, that's cool.
Soft power is the ability to attract and co-opt rather than coerce, in parentheses, hard power. Soft power is the ability to shape the preferences of others through appeal and attraction.
So it could be, and it could be that, and it could be several other things too. So it sounds like it's just how you influence, or how you impact. But I never would have been thinking about that in underwriting a country a few years ago, to be honest.
Public perception.
Right.
Just to kind of get the feels of like, you know, what,
Right.
what
Well, okay.
might be
so
social media, digital.
Right, so sentiment, I would convert that into sentiment then. So, and we can see there are many different indices that actually measure sentiment. So right now, what's happening in the world, or in the US specifically, so the manufacturing index went down. Oh, sorry, speaking of indices, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. The manufacturing index went down for the last quarter for the US. However, the consumer sentiment went up a little. So what's happening is us, consumers, are still spending. We still feel confident that our paychecks are going to be there, we're gonna be okay, inflation is withheld within normal bounds, whatever. So we're still spending. Now, it could be that it hasn't caught up with us yet. But this is a big discussion that's going on right now in terms of thinking about monetary and fiscal policy for the country. Because you look at what's happening manufacturing-wise with the decreasing, that's going to have an impact. But maybe it hasn't filtered down yet into us and our pocketbooks, our wallets. So that's a really important one. Because people do look at that, and that's like, you know, around the holiday season, everyone's like, okay, what are the consumers going to be doing, and all of that. Okay, so, and it's interesting because, so these are the different, again, sort of subheadings of sustainability, talent, housing, and how it translates into these different types of cities, and the problems that they face. So it depends on what stage you're in and where you are and how these different metrics are going to manifest itself in that particular country in a particular time. So, and it could be that, you know, the new world city will morph ultimately into established world city, but for the time being, the talent is maybe a little harder to get or to afford the talent in a new world city as opposed to some place that's already established. So these are the different pieces of the puzzle, but they work very differently or impact very differently in terms of how you're going to think about what's happening in those particular countries. So then there's, again, the new world cities, the challengers, the emerging megacities. So, I mean, you don't have to know all of this as much as just understand that there is a movement to understand where and what's happening in the world relative to each other and analyzing cities. So look at high potential. Nairobi, Hanoi, and Ho Chi Minh City. Emerging cities, Manila, Chennai, Delhi, Mumbai. So you're looking essentially at Asia and Africa for opportunities in terms of how this is being And agile high value, same thing. It's mostly India and China. So this is where the opportunities lie potentially versus where the already strong ones have been. So these, and now look at this one. So the top 10, 15, the top 20, all of them. The top 20 cities in terms of momentum. So momentum means changes that are happening within the city, and you can look up how JLL actually, the different metrics they use for that. But they're saying essentially that the cities that have the most growth opportunities, is what it translates into, none of them are in the U.S. or North America, for that matter.
My city is one.
Your city's in there?
My city is one.
Oh,
Bangalore.
Bangalore. Okay, cool. So it's quite astonishing. The world is really in a major, major shift right now. And as a real estate investor, that provides opportunity, but also caution about going to the tried and true. Because what is going to happen to the ones back here, the established world cities in the next 5 to 10 years? It's hard to say. And you could probably put different levels of returns on each of these boxes. That would be several hundred basis point difference between each of the different groups.
Just a question. So for like the high potential to become a new world city in the future, it essentially means they would then meet these criteria, right?
Yeah, so right, exactly, good point. Yeah, so they would then start to get some of the other parts of, let's see, if you look at it. It's a good question. So business framework. So they would have more competitive business climate, the tax regime would be stronger, land use would be bigger development efforts, so sustainable inequality. Housing is a big one. So that would be affordability to suit under 35, so that would be more of a fulsome housing marketplace that would be starting to develop. So it would be like when the housing range and affordability to suit under 35s was completed, and then they're looking to move into a much broader kind of category, if that was appropriate. Maybe it's not, depending on the demographics. So part of this will be very much driven by the demographics of a particular region. So this was back in 2016, I wanted to show you. Look at the difference. That's the same momentum index from now, nothing in North America, versus back then, you had London #1, you had Silicon Valley is #2, you had New York 7, San Francisco 10. So what I said before about watching patterns and shifts, that's really telling. That in a matter of 3 years, the US was kicked off that list. Now, I'd want to go back and see again what all the different pieces of the puzzle of what momentum means to JLL. But still, if let's say we're assuming it's credible, I'd be curious to understand what exactly, and here, let me tell you what the different variables are. Population, technology, environment. You know, we haven't spoken at all, and they didn't do the debates either, on climate control, climate environmental issues. And I can tell you, if you go and look on any of the pension funds' websites, almost all of them, the public ones, will have commentary for having some kind of ESG analysis of any deal that they go into now. And a lot of them have they have what's called GRESB, which stands for, but essentially it's a board that's come together to try to get all the pension funds to participate in climate control by using their money in terms of where they invest. So it's a very big movement afoot now, and something that is very critical, and you should be thinking about when you're doing your write-ups about how that's working through in your particular country. So here you can see these all make sense to me, these different variables: prices, technology, population, education, connectivity, construction. So that's quite something. And then 14 to 17, here's actually the flow of how that happened. And you could use this in your presentations and to see where exactly your cities are and what's been happening to them over the last few years.
With environment,
Yeah.
does it make a difference if a country withdraws from the Kyoto Agreement or they're not a part of it?
Yeah, yes, it's a good question. Yes, because if they are moving away from it
Yeah.
and they're not going to have certain regulations and it's going to, so like look at what's happening in Beijing. You had a lot of the expat community move out of Beijing to Hong Kong. This was maybe 2 years ago now, because the pollution was so bad that people were getting asthma and lung-related diseases. So you can look at that and say, well, if they're going to be removing pollution controls, then that's going to have an impact on whether or not they're going to be able to attract the people that you want to live in those communities. So,
It's gonna be like a cynical kind of view to suggest that that might be an opportune place to purchase certain types of industrial property, given that certain companies might prefer the
but
lack
if you want
of.
if you want to perpetuate the coal and gray, then yes. Yes.
But maybe not for a big company because they're measured by their total carbon emissions.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So
That's right.
maybe.
So you have to think about that too, right? Who it is that you're representing, and whether or not that's going to be permissible, based on their identity and such. Oh, here it is. Okay, so here, this is Rise of Japan's secondary cities. So this is a present for you guys again, giving you everything here. So secondary cities in Japan, Osaka and Fukuoka, are having growth because it's so expensive in Tokyo. So it's this kind of thing that you're going to look at. And here, Osaka is going to get boosted infrastructure. Look at infrastructure investing. Why? Because you can't do anything without roads, bridges, mass transit, whatever. I mean, you start to see that actually money is being spent. It changes the whole dynamic. I was looking at investment in Brazil in agriculture years ago, and great farmland, Brazil's one of 2 places in the world where you can grow crops year-round. However, they had no roads to get the produce to the port to be able to export it. So, and they said, oh, we're going to spend the money. They didn't. So the point is, without the infrastructure, it's not going to be good. So here, you can start to look at these secondary and tertiary markets as opportunities by looking at some of these things that they're talking about here. Here, Osaka tops the real estate momentum sub-index. So pull out the index for this stuff and look at it for your countries and see what they say. 5 trends to watch. Cities becoming more powerful and influential. So what's happened here in the US? Some cities didn't, like, look at California fighting the federal government right now, fighting Trump, essentially. Saying we need to have the pollution controls and everything else. So, even though Nate was going to go invest there. So, point being that people want to be masters of their own universe, and the federal government doesn't necessarily know what's best for a community. So the cities have become, and the mayors and governors have become a lot more powerful and vocal in trying to get done what they want to get done. So that's a very important trend. Let's see, environmental concerns you spoke about, and technology. How connected is that city? What's it called? 5G, whatever. You know, is that there now? Are they planning for it? What's happening with that? Here are, again, I'm not showing you this that you need to look at all of this. I'm just showing you what exists so that you know that it's out there. There are 500 indices for cities to be able to determine what's really happening. And it goes into even culture, diversity and openness, and brand influence, and investment in business attraction. So you can start to look at that to see for your cities whether or not that, how it ranks. So these are all the roadmaps for you. So the other piece of this is that, so here it says there are 500 city indices. Who makes them? Where are they coming from? So here are a variety of different sort of manufacturers of these indices. So take a look, and again, you don't need to follow all of them, you don't need to know all of them, but pick one or two that you think could be appropriate for what you're looking at and start to look at some of them. Now, this is key. So you saw that there was the top 7 sort of old-time kind of cities out there, the solid ones, that like the New Yorks and Paris, London. Well, they account for almost a quarter of global real estate investing for 3 years. And so remember what we said, there's only so many places an institutional investor can even invest into because of availability and just the marketplace generally. So you can see here, there is a slant towards these cities. And so if you said you want to invest 50% of your capital into Fukuoka, that might be really very difficult. So even though that's a city on the rise, it's not necessarily true that you're gonna be able to do too much there. So keep that in mind too. Here, so London and New York were between 10 and 15% of all global investment for those years. It's quite significant. So this makes sense, this is just logic, that the correlation of the city's competitiveness and cross-border real estate investment. So you're looking at how competitive the city is versus how much capital from overseas is coming in to invest into that city. And we can look at the correlations between that and see maybe a positive one for the highly competitive one. So you look at on top, London, DC, Frankfurt, Tokyo, Singapore, all these highly competitive cities getting a lot of bulk of the foreign capital, which we would expect. And this is more of the same, innovators. And here, so this looks at how much capital, the second from the left column is our investment volumes, how much has been changed, and what the yields have been. And versus the economic growth, which I guess is like the GDP, I'm assuming. So you can start to see what the yields look like versus the GDP versus how much capital has been going into these cities. So again, London seems to stand out tremendously, but if you want to really get your high return, you're going to a place like Moscow, but you're rolling the dice there. So again, that high correlation, but it's good to just see where you are in the scheme of things and what kind of returns you're getting and such. But people don't necessarily stop to look at, well, what does my return profile look like compared to how much capital is coming in compared to what the yield on government bonds are. But I think that tells you a very interesting story in terms of what the opportunity set looks like. So this was, you should look at Real Capital Analytics, by the way. It's a very good group. They do a lot of analyzing data, mostly US, but they look at other places as well. The biggest price gainers look at San Francisco and LA. Seoul went backwards, probably because of what's happening with North Korea. And Amsterdam, I don't know why that happened, but sort of interesting. Anyway, so you can start to see in terms of pricing. So what this is showing you, there's a lot of information out there on the kinds of things that we've been talking about. So I'm not just making this stuff up. This is how, you know, a lot of institutional investors look at real estate investing, not just a cap rate or a rent number, but these kinds of movements in the markets. Liquid property markets, again, something we've been talking about a lot. So less liquidity in Asia Pacific versus Europe, and although look at Tokyo, looks pretty good, and the US. And then looking at some very long-term returns for these different marketplaces. It's interesting that, and this is for like 16 years, but look at the difference between the returns between London and New York, same size but different risk profile. Pretty interesting there. Tokyo's there too. I would say that's probably moved down the curve somewhat now though. And this also shows the standard deviations, it shows you the volatility as well. And then we have, in fact, our friends, the Sharpe ratio and the Sortino ratios. So again, the volatility. So we just looked at all the different pieces of the puzzle in terms of returns, and now looking at what are those returns telling us? Where are they coming from? How reliable are they? And this is a great chart because this also shows you post global financial crisis versus pre, and where things sit. So I'm not concerned about the results as much as just showing you how it works. And then you're also going to have to make a recommendation in terms of what you're looking to buy. So we're going to look at all the different asset sectors and also what structure. Should we just go buy REITs? Whatever form of REIT, publicly traded shares are in your marketplace? Or should we go buy the property itself? Should we go in directly ourselves? Should we find a partner? Should we go find a fund, a private fund to invest into that's going into that marketplace? How do we want to do it? What does the structure look like? Greenfield. So are we doing development? That's what greenfield is. Are we doing a development deal, or are we buying something that's already existing? How much risk is development going to add to the puzzle, but how much more return do you think we can get for that? Same. Again, more rankings of the cities. Which are the financial centers? You know, what you might want to say also is that I want to do a portfolio, and I want to have some diversity. I don't want to just buy office buildings. I do think there's some opportunity both in retail and office, or whatever it is you come up with, and do that way. Disposable income growth. So again, back to the macroeconomics. That is looking at just developed and emerging cities, that kind of growth, and that's quite significant. That's a very telltale sign. Lima made the chart. First time I've seen Lima in any of the charts. It's a good sign.
Probably not today, right? Is this recent?
This is 2015. So, and the investment intensity, so where people are going to invest into. And then get into the real estate itself. So here you can look at rents on a comparative basis. Look how expensive Hong Kong is. I wonder what's happening now.
Oh,
So this is, once you get into the prime office rents in the most expensive markets worldwide. And then into the dominant finance and business sectors. From a tenant's perspective, so you're trying to attract tenants at the end of the day. Where is it most efficient for a tenant to be leasing? So we've been talking from an investor's perspective this whole class. But there's also the flip side of that, thinking from the tenant's perspective of what it costs them to actually be there. So that's the rents, the occupier costs and such. So look at the cost of Hong Kong compared to New York even. It's quite significant difference. And then the vacancy in the markets. So now you move into the real estate parameters that you can looking at. And here's how much real estate has been in different cities, investment levels. So transparency, you've touched upon that. There are all types of transparency, just transparency meaning visibility of information. So we spoke about the fact that if the city has, or a country, whatever, has a publicly traded REIT marketplace, that right there helps us to have some insight into the marketplace, not full for private, but then we said, what else exists out there to help us to understand the private markets that we've been talking about a lot?
The indices.
Thank you. So the indices, the IPDs of the world and such, and we're gonna run through that in a minute. But we want to understand real estate taxes, the fundamentals of the marketplace itself, or the real estate marketplace, valuations, bidding, if sometimes there's an auction process in a place that's very transparent versus not. So all of these pieces come into, they have 115 different factors that they use to actually judge whether or not a place is transparent or not. And they break it down into these different five categories. And here more of the details behind it. So here are, this is an old chart, but just again, looking at that movement. Because if you're going to start to see a city move up in the transparency index, that's going to be a real signal to you that there's an opportunity potentially for purchasing. But if it's already totally transparent, it's less likely that you're going to find some interesting opportunities. But watch, I guess monitor or take a look at the different patterns that are happening. So here in this chart, so Asia Pacific is the most consistently improving region. Okay? And so here, this is exactly what you said. So transparency rises with investment activity. So as soon as the information starts to flow, investors feel comfortable they can come in. Because they know what they're getting, they know what they're looking at. They can do an analysis and it will make some sense to them. It's not just guesswork. And then there are these sub-indices within the different regions that you can start to look at to see where your countries fit. Developed versus emerging markets. And then, again, I'm not so interested in the results here as much as just you understand that these things exist. Like, look at this, Japan jumped 7 places in 1 year, I guess it is. Yeah, it's over a year. Vietnam is on the cusp of semi-transparent, but jumping 7 places, that's quite significant. And I can tell you, when we started investing there back in 2001, there was no information. You just couldn't find anything. And it was very, very closed marketplace. So, and because at that time, up until recently, it was the 2nd largest economy in the world, Japan. So it was a natural magnet for institutional capital to be moving there. So that also helped push the fact that it became more transparent because more investors demanded that kind of information flow. And the REIT market started to take off. Here's your ESG, sustainability, there are rankings now of all this, I started to say before this GRESB. So, it's what you would expect, pretty much, in terms of information, or lack of information. But this was interesting, so, and this is where the government comes into this, pretty significantly. So the Modi government was implementing new reforms, notably the Real Estate Regulation and Development Act. And so you can see how it started to change the impact, the transparency, and encourage the kind of investing that goes along with the higher transparency. We just saw the correlation was high, so that really helps. And in China, where there hasn't been a lot of transparency, but there's a professionalization of the real estate sector that's been happening, because again, now that's the second largest economy in the world, and if you follow what happened in Japan, China is right smack there, more so because of the size of it. So that is almost like, it's like not even a question that you're going to have significant amounts of capital from overseas moving into the Chinese real estate market now that it's allowed. And this is in spite of the fact that it's less transparent. And part of it is which comes first, the capital push or the regulatory push? And you can argue both, and you can see both, one sometimes in different places, more so than others. So I gave you again, that was nice, the different indices to be thinking about and looking at for your reviews, because that's what you're going to look at. You're going to say, how has the real estate been doing in my marketplace? And you can access some of these databases. Here's my benchmarks. So this is the Global Real Estate Fund Index that's been starting to grow. And that's, again, the private side of the world, not publicly traded, but these private funds that are the banks or investment managers that put these groups of investors together based on a particular strategy to invest for a particular set time into a particular strategy in a particular part of the world or a global. Look, Blackstone raised, was it $20 billion of equity to invest globally into real estate. So what was that? That was a global private, not traded on any marketplace, private fund that is a closed-end fund, has a finite life. I don't know the life, it's probably 10 years, is my guess. And they're investing globally. I don't know what returns they're targeting or what the strategy is, but that is an example of what would be in one of these indices that they would be measuring. But you think about that, that's $20 billion of equity. So they're going to leverage that, and that's only one of their funds, right? And that's only on the private side. Their constant inflow of capital from the public side. So they're going, as we've said, they have to buy companies and all sorts of things. But it's quite astonishing, 20 billion. So anyway, so you can monitor and see what the returns have been in the private side through some of these kind of indices. Here's the Global Property Index, MPD. That's the Global Real Estate Fund Index, more of that. And then also look at, like here's the S&P Dow Jones. Okay, so that's publicly traded, right? What I wanted to show you here is look at the pie chart and look at the largest slice of the pie. Diversified real estate activities. What do you think? What is that? What would you think that is?
Private development.
Diversified real estate activities. You see the pie chart? So this is, okay, so what this is an index, right, of a publicly traded index, right? And remember, you actually, I think you had asked, what is an index essentially? What is the what is the Dow Jones? You had asked, I think. And we discussed that it's the Dow Jones is or the S&P is a group of stocks that are publicly traded, and it's a weighted average return for those stocks. So they choose like the top, the strongest, biggest companies they typically choose. And that's made, so like GE was kicked out of the Dow Jones because they didn't hit certain hurdles. If you all, I don't know if you follow them at all, but so they have to have certain performance to make it into these indices. All right, so it's a weighted average of the returns for a particular day. Like you hear on the radio, the S&P went up, the Dow Jones went down, blah 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 blah. That's what that is. Okay, so that's what this is. This is the S&P Dow Jones Indice for Asia Property 40. So it's probably 40 different property companies in Asia that are publicly traded that make up this index. Okay? Now, however, let's say it's these 40 companies, this is the breakdown of what these companies do. So you get to see what it is you're investing into. So the first one, the purple, is the largest piece of the pie, and it's almost half. And it says that they're doing diversified real estate activities. So what do you think that is? What would that be? Just guess.
Buying, selling, renting.
Could it be like some that might fall into multiple categories? Like wouldn't REITs be developing in some cases as well? So it wouldn't necessarily fit into retail REIT and development, it might fit into the
Portfolios
diversified
of-
management.
It could be anything. It could be making concrete, I don't know. I mean, I'm being a little flip, but not too much. My point is, when you're investing, remember we looked at investing in private versus public, and in private, you sort of know what you're getting. There's a distinct strategy. You're going to buy industrial buildings on the east coast of Maine or something, whatever. On public companies, it's whole separate companies doing lots of different things. They could be doing transportation, they could be doing infrastructure, it could be all sorts of things that also fall under this category of what they're calling real estate. I don't know how they're defining real estate.
So I guess depending on this, but theoretically it could include like a brokerage firm or something?
Yes.
That's not
Right.
actually doing any property themselves,
Correct.
but still
It could be like a JLL or a CBRE or something, yeah, absolutely. So when you look at these REITs or a REIT version, you need to see what specifically they're investing into.
To find, like, for example, with the Dow Jones index, do they specifically categorize only for real estate as well, or will it always be equity involved?
Yeah, so they'll have real estate in the Dow Jones, I think only a few years ago, they came out with a separate category for real estate. It was under financials. It used to be just bulked under financials. And I think maybe, I want to say 3-4 years ago is when they finally came out with a separate category for real estate. But you can find the real estate index within the Dow Jones, and they have different ones as well.
Okay.
And that will be, and you'll see that they have 50 companies or 10 companies, whatever it is, and then you'll see what watch the flows of the returns based on what their performance has been. Okay? But this is why you have to be really careful, and that you think about public versus private, you need to know what you're buying. Okay, so that's just more of that. And then we want to look at also the private funds. We just spoke about looking at that. Part of it is what's actually available. Here, you have only opportunity, like Africa, look at Africa. You only have opportunistic returns or fund products to invest into Africa. So even though you might say, oh, I want X, X might not exist. So you have to also see what it is that's actually available. Dry powder. So we just spoke about Blackstone raising $20 billion of equity. It could be that they have a hard time putting money out. In other words, investing money, investment capital. So what's called dry powder means that, so all these different private funds have raised boatloads of money, but they haven't been able to find deals that fit the parameters of what the strategy is that they're trying to do. So what happens is, to the managers, they can't, after a certain point in time, they get usually around 3 to 4 years to put the money out, to invest the money based on these fund structures. If they can't do it, they have to give the money back to the investors. And none of these managers want to do that, because why? They're because fees, right, they'll lose the fees. So what happens? They'll just go to do the deals. You just have to look at what motivates people. So that could be, so dry powder is very important to look at in terms of how much capital is in the marketplace chasing deals. So if there's too much institutional capital in the marketplace, what's going to happen?
Drive up prices and drive down yields.
Exactly, drives returns down, exactly. So understanding how much capital is in your marketplace, you don't want to walk into a market that has so much capital that it's just going to hurt your returns down the road. This is looking at where the investors come from. So this I looked at two. So I'm just about finished now with this, and we'll look at Mexico. We'll take a break. We'll look at Mexico. So Canada. So this is real estate capital market. Looking at where is the capital coming from, because you want to look at both the debt and equity markets, right? And you want to see, is there some major shift that's happening in those marketplaces? Like look at debt capital for refinancing in 2016 was totally oversupplied, 40% bubble in the middle there. So there's just too much debt.
Is this like a survey they took?
They follow this stuff.
I was just wondering, like, what if 48% mean? 48% of people said it was in balance, or like?
Oh, well, in terms of if there's a imbalance, they would say that I think it's more a matter of.
I guess it says at the bottom, it's respondents. It must be a kind of a survey.
Right, so it's I don't think it's a survey as much as an opinion, as much as where are you? Like, I don't think they would ask them what's your opinion? Because that wouldn't mean anything. As much as you have how much debt to put out, how much equity to put out. Now, they do. I'm sure it's blind.
Yep.
And it's a handful of these guys. I mean, the question is how many of these people.
Yeah, and who
is
are
it
they?
2? Or is it 200?
Absolutely.
Right? So that's part of the question. But you start to see where these imbalances are, and then again, so you might look at this and say, I'm going to be a debt. I want to do debt because I know the banks are going sideways, and here's an opportunity to get some strong yields and steady. I'm not going to make the opportunity for appreciation, but I'm happy. It's okay. Right? And then here's more equity undersupplied. So here, like in 2016, was totally undersupplied of equity, Canada, according to this. And then this was more sentiment. So this was how they felt about. Nothing was excellent. I like that. So there's only room for growth. So, but you can find things like this to talk about. And then they ranked the different markets in which to look for. And then Vienna has a whole, sort of interesting in Vienna, the housing market. They have a funding process from the government to help to create sort of well, they did, I don't know what's happening now since government's changed a lot, but they wanted to have a very sort of mixed bag of different types of residents. And they were trying to create very homogeneous, and they were giving funding to not tear down buildings, but to renovate buildings and to retrofit them. So understanding something like that in the marketplace, like I know like right now San Francisco, you know, has some housing, rent control laws. New York has, certain places in the world I think do and don't, I'm not sure which, but understanding something like that, and how that impacts the real estate is pretty important.
Would labor laws be included in that?
Yes, absolutely, yeah. And also look at what's happening with just the minimum wage here. Like something like that's really important, because what we spoke about before is looking at talent, resources as part of a really key part of the puzzle of underwriting a market to invest into. Thinking back again what I said about Amazon. If you look at the places that Amazon chose as potential places to build that second headquarters, they were all lots of university towns, Boston in particular. So all that talent and how you're going to pay them, and go back to one of the pages about like the emerging and developing markets that spoke to the fact that they thought they didn't have enough money to pay talent necessarily, and that's a problem, so they wouldn't be able to attract the talent to some of these emerging cities.
A lot of companies just bring them in, don't they?
You have to pay them.
Yeah.
So if you don't have a marketplace there, it's a little tough. I mean, they could offer people from their headquarters, let's say, to move into this other city, but there has to be an infrastructure there of housing, shopping. I mean, even getting people to move downtown, like Battery Park, had been an issue for some time because there wasn't any real, like, where did you go food shopping? So infrastructure matters, and paying, you know, the ability to make it a viable economic investment include big. You look at most profit and loss statements. One of the biggest components is staff, or salaries and benefits. So that's a huge piece of that. And if the revenues aren't going to compensate for that, it doesn't make any sense. So that's, and also people aren't necessarily like living there. So they don't want to live there. They want to be a pioneer. But maybe you have to pay them more to be that pioneer, to get them there. But it's not a mass number of people.
How do we include government incentives that we get? Say we're moving a whole portfolio to a country where saying it's got a value of in the millions. So since we are bringing the whole the sizable investment like into a country, government is generally inclined to provide some sort of an incentive, like a tax break or a.
Yes, so that's right. But that's what happened with Amazon here. They're getting
$5 billion.
$5 billion. Yeah, it was $5 billion.
Breaks.
As an incentive, and that's huge. That's a huge piece of the puzzle. What nobody was looking at was that at the same time they had given Hudson Yards $6 billion. So no one was talking about that. But yeah, it's very critical. And not every you know, some people see it as sort of blackmail, or you know, whatever you want to call it, quid pro quo of having to pay to get these companies. And what I think a lot of governments don't do is the math behind it to understand what happens if they leave, how many years do they have to stay to pay revenues and sales taxes and income tax and corporate taxes and stuff to justify that.
It's interesting, in Canada, it's illegal for municipal governments to give tax incentives to companies. Only the province can do it, because they found that overall, like, they were competing against each other, and they kind of like, you ended up losing more than you ended up winning, especially the province overall. So they looked in the long run, a lot of these deals they had cut, they were actually negative for the city in the long run. They were negative for the province. They just said no more municipal incentives.
Makes sense.
There's some exceptions, obviously, for brownfields and things like that, but.
Right.
Interesting.
So, alright, so you have a good gist of what we're looking for and how to look at different pieces of a country's macro and micro perspectives. I'm gonna go through what I did on Mexico in a bit. I can't look at that clock. What time is it?
7:45.
Okay.
Or 20.
So, also, but let's spend a few minutes on, anyone wanna talk about their indices and what they're learning from that? And how that's working out for everybody. I'll put my Mexico thing up in a while. Okay, Victor, how about you? What do you, which indices have you started to look at and where are you?
I've looked at a couple of subsections of the FTSE.
Okay.
But I wasn't really,
Do you have it?
I don't have my-
Have you learned anything from it? Has it helped
I
you?
don't have my laptop with me with my notes
Okay.
on it, but no, I did,
But just looking at the public market for real estate,
yeah.
how has that helped you to figure out whether or not you want to be investing into real estate?
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest,
Okay.
as of yet. I didn't see much volatility in it. But yeah, I didn't really know what else we need to look for, I guess.
Well,
that
maybe
much.
pick a few other
Yeah.
indices. So
Yeah.
I've been giving a whole bunch of different real estate ones that would help also, and then some of the other ones that we've looked at, like I mentioned before, manufacturing index, if you're interested in industrial buildings, or
Yeah.
there's also, I've given like hundreds of these different
No, I know.
indices. So
I-
start to
I
plot
looked a little bit.
those.
Yeah.
Okay, anyone else? Jared, how are you doing?
Good.
Good. I don't mean like what did you have for breakfast?
No, I did. Here, I have it here.
I want you guys to learn something from this. It's not just like, I'm not trying to pick on you guys as much as like use this. Learn for it to become a natural part of your.
So I was looking at Dow Jones U.S. Real Estate Index, which is pretty like.
Okay.
I guess that, and then also the FTSE Global.
Okay.
And so, yeah, I tracked. So the Dow Jones one was easier to track because I could track it every day. 'Cause it
Right.
I just look.
So what are you learning from? What is that all telling you about investing into real estate? Right,
Yeah,
okay.
I don't know.
Fair
Yeah,
enough,
yeah.
okay. That's
I
why I'm
mean, I
pushing
was
everybody
also,
right
I
now.
was also like looking a lot online for real estate indices, like trying to get ones that either have like daily or monthly, I guess prices or
Right.
or like reporting. I couldn't really. It was for me. It was just. It was like.
It's hard.
It's hard. Yeah. I couldn't
Okay,
really
so
find it.
let's start with the question. What is it that we think, what can we do with this? What are we trying to accomplish? Let's start with that. What are we trying to accomplish?
Trying to make predictions or forecast about
Right.
where we should be investing.
About what?
Where we should be investing, what we should be investing in or not investing in.
Okay, good. All right, so we're trying to use this as a tool
Yeah.
for us to figure out, should we be investing, and if we should be, what should we be investing into?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we
Okay.
have apartments, we have office, industrial, retail. Just
Okay.
leave it at that, those
Yeah.
four,
Yeah.
okay? So, we've seen there's certain private indicators, I've given you that, in terms of what the funds are doing.
Mhm.
Okay, so that's one thing, to just see what's been happening with the private fund market,
Mhm.
right? That's one thing. So, residential, what do you think is going to give us a clue whether or not we should be investing into residential?
Building permits, housing
Right.
starts, income in certain areas, population growth.
Right, all the things we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So pick one or two of those, or what I spoke about before about manufacturing, if you're thinking about industrial. Think about what is it that you need, what are these tools going to tell us about the opportunity. So if we see the manufacturing is going all the way down, so we're going to run away from industrial buildings, right? So, Brenda?
So for something like that, you would look at the LEI, I guess.
Right, so, okay, so, right, so we had the leading economic indicators, so that's a basket of, what do we say, it was like 20 or a whole
10.
bunch of indices. So that's a good framework for us, just to see what's going on. So that's a good place to start, right? So that's going to give us a sense of just the general marketplace. So that would be the first one to start with, great. And then we would go narrower, if we want to say we want to watch, to invest, and we just want to do real estate. So let's say we just want to do real estate. So let's look at the LEI. We could look at the public markets, the indices for the real estate in the public. What else?
I was tracking some stuff, kind of looking at industrial buildings. So a couple of things I was looking at were like the industrial production index, which is only once a month, and it hasn't changed all that much. And they still haven't released the numbers for September, but I kind of went back and it's gone up and down a little bit, but for the most part, it's above the historical average, which kind of goes with the trend right now of industrial performing particularly well.
But that's, wait, so I wanna make sure everyone heard that. So that's a really good point that Nate's bringing up, is that we want to look at where it is on a historical basis. So even though you can only get maybe once a month or whatever it is, and it's not moving, it's, it's like 0.1% here or there, what is it over the 5-10 year average? That's really what you wanna look at. Now all of a sudden we're getting someplace. Now we're getting a big picture. Now we're going to see, okay, this is where manufacturing is. We want to see where the real estate market is. So what are we going to use for the real estate market?
Can you use NACRE?
Yes, exactly. Right. The NPI. So NACRE is the private market, right? And the actual index is called NPI, National Property Index, I think it is, NPI.
NPI, yeah.
Right? So you use that. So now you're getting to see, okay, what's happening in real estate. And again, where are we on a 5-10 year basis? There was I will send it out. There was a slide I put up that looked at the global head of research at LaSalle, MIT, PhD, brilliant guy, and he tracked, I'll send it out so you can all look at it, the various indices to follow to be able to predict a downturn in the real estate market. And one of them was LEI, and then he had several others as well. But things like that, when you start to put that together, you can create a story. Once you create a story, at the end of the day, that's what this is. This is telling you the story of what, it's not what we think or feel about the market. I mean, at the end of the day, we'll have to make investments based on gut, but the gut should be informed as best we can. And these types of helpers are out there to guide us and give us information, and we should be using them. So, does that make more sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's try this again. Not now. Everyone's like, oh. No, when you go home. And next week bring it back. Well, next week you'll present, so the week after. So follow for 2 weeks. Or you can even send me if you want. Send me your pics, and I'll respond to you. But pick public, private, macro, and then micro. And you could say, I'm interested in the industrial market, this is what I want to follow, or I'm interested in the residential market, or office market, or retail. Someone could do hotels. You can follow hotel REITs. Look at Starwood, something like that.
And then in that email we send you, or if we just add a little kind of, this is what we think is happening kind of thing. So we're following industrial, we're following this, and this is
Or you could,
our
if you want,
interpretation or what we've learned from it, or
You could even just send me, here are the 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever number indices I'm going to follow here, and that, and you can just leave it
Okay.
at that. And it's not like a homework as much as just, I want you to be thinking about it, and I want to make sure that you're on the right track. I saw a lot of blank faces. So, okay, all right, so let's take a break so I can get some water. And then I'm going to take you through Mexico. So if you wanna go get a tortilla or something, you can.
Okay, cool.
I didn't realize what kind of thing, so I have a okay.
Gotcha.
Oh, okay. First and second. All right.
Yeah,
Have you guys
sure.
started it
So
yet?
these two?
The sign
Yeah.
but I sent
So animals. Did you start?
Okay.
Did you start your work on Friends? You know what?
I mean, of course I'm gonna.
No, I understand, me too. Okay, cool. So,
How do you want to split this up?
So what do you want to do it?
yeah, for sure. For this one,
Okay,
I'm
here.
gonna
Sorry?
I think
probably
I care. I think it should be first half
get
or
your
second
advice
half.
on this, just
Or
because
two sections, right?
Who was
we
your?
probably have more expertise in
Alejandro.
like
Oh,
making
Alejandro.
an
So
actual
you look at
investment
Alejandro.
recommendation.
Yeah, do you have
I'm
any
gonna try
preference
to
on
do
which
this
one is
without
gonna
like
cover?
that, and then I'll
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm happy to do either
Yeah,
one.
So he's
Okay, so then
on Japan.
And I think ideally too, we try to like at some point before Thursday we send them to each other because like if
On your own.
you know, one of us has a bunch of conclusions in the second half that don't vibe with what we say in the first
Yeah,
half of the
sure.
presentation, then it won't make any sense.
Okay.
Oh, that's true.
Did she? I wasn't paying attention. Like,
Let's
she
do the
said formalized. Did
conclusions
she say she
together
wants a
then.
paper and
The recommendation.
Okay.
Yeah.
我让你
Right.
想头这样。
I think it's just gonna be the same thing on both documents, pretty much.
I mean, it
right?
almost
like,
like
maybe
might
the
make
PowerPoint's
more
just like a
sense
more condensed
to do
Yeah.
to split the first two between the two of us.
But,
'Cause those are gonna be give us a good overview
Should
of
I
the whole
create like
market,
a
and then
Google
the
doc
investment
so
and
that we can
recommendation
work on
section
it
is
at
gonna be
the
very
same
short
time?
once we have all the information.
That's fine.
Okay.
Okay.
Do you think that makes sense?
I'll, you know,
I don't wanna make it any more complicated than it does. I just, one of us does all the background information and then we make the recommendation. You can't really make the recommendation without having the background information, right?
Okay. Cool. That sounds
Yeah.
good. I'll share
Or,
it with you.
because
And then I'll
normally
start
what
a
I like
Google
to do is as I'm working on
PowerPoint
it,
thing
I'll
too.
see an opportunity and then I'll just put it to the side and then I'll have recommendations by the end of it.
Okay.
I'm just kind of looking at the prevailing trends. Yeah, we could do that. We could split up the first two and then we'll do.
I'll do the same thing as I'm going through it. I'll just put, whenever I see any kind of opportunity or things that I think I'd recommend, I'll put them aside and then we can kind of see where we overlap at the end and just,
So.
like the investment thing, it's gonna be probably like one page like we have in our last presentation, and the investment will be probably one page or two slides at most, same thing with the other part. So we can probably get that done pretty quickly once the first part's done.
Okay.
So I think that's fine.
Would you rather do market elements or prevailing trends?
Prevailing trends.
Okay.
Yeah, if you want, if you guys want to
Right.
break up into a group, into your teams for a few minutes, that's fine. We can do that.
Just wanna talk it over quickly.
I should have said that. Sorry.
Actually, the indexes I've been looking at.
Yeah, sure.
This is what your thoughts were.
Yeah.
I just picked kind of a couple random ones in a couple different industries. Obviously,
Oops, sorry.
I always do that. I touch the screen. The treasury yields are obviously just something I
Right.
always have.
Mhm.
And then the LEI, which that's only monthly.
These are
but-
good. These are good.
And then
Yeah,
the only thing
I
I
like
haven't been
those.
doing is adding some some of the public and
Uh-huh.
private real estate.
Yeah, so do
Entities,
so do
but-
one or two of those. Yeah.
Okay,
Cool. Yeah, these are good.
great.
As I said, I'll send out. You know what? No, I don't want to start. I'll send out that page, and you'll see what he uses, and it's because what you're trying to do is predict the downturns.
Well, the thing about a lot of these too is you have to look like a ways back or look at what the average is, because like some of these they went from 112.02 to 112.05, and it's like what's the difference? But
Right.
considering
But
that's
it's-
over a base of 100 over the average, that's shows us quite a bit higher
Right.
than what it has been.
Right. Right.
So
The
month
other
to
thing
month-
is to look at also, what we actually discussed, is looking at like CMBS issuances and things like that. Because then you're seeing, like right before the global financial crisis, if you remember in did a slide on the amount of CMBS issuances, which is
Well,
through
and
the
we're
roof.
pretty close right now to 2007,
Seven.
so.
I know. But they feel it's still up, but I don't know. So you
I mean,
can
they
do
said there
things
was
like
nothing
that.
to be worried about in 2007 too, right? So.
I don't know.
I'm convinced that no one does.
Right. And anyone who does, it's just luck of the draw.
So
Yeah, so you
yeah,
guys.
so we're doing Japan, right?
Sure.
Hi.
Perfect.
I just created a folder in Google Drive and shared it with you. It has both the Word doc and the presentation file.
Okay.
How can I forecast it?
Yeah, we should.
To forecast, well, Brexit is something that's happening, sort of, but the
Well, I
question
mean, we
is
could
what
work on
kind
it
of
over the
impact.
weekend. We could coordinate
So
and
you
we
would
can
want,
meet up.
look at, so you can say, okay, let's say Brexit is most impactful on London. So you might look at how much capital, because like I even showed before, how much capital has been invested into London over the last few years. So that's one way of looking at that. You can look at the occupancy in London in terms of tenants, are tenants leaving London as an example?
Yeah.
You could look at the currency, you
Yeah.
could look at the
We
pound,
should definitely
the movement
So
of
you
the
can
pound.
just forecast
We
the
can coordinate on
interest rate and to
Well, you're
make
not
some predictions.
forecasting. You're just looking at what are the different indices telling you,
Alright, okay.
right? So you're taking that information, and then that information is going to tell you at the end of the term a story of to do something or not to do something maybe, if you're picking the right indices. Right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Mm-hmm.
So can I ask you something real about the first assignment?
Yeah, of course.
So just for my own understanding,
Mm-hmm.
I sort of revised the calculations I did.
Oh, okay.
And I just wanted to make sure I had this nominal investment hurdle correct. So I fixed the sovereign risk so that now they're negative, and then
Right, okay.
I didn't add the leverage and and made some other changes. But in terms of this number, so this number, the nominal investment hurdle is supposed to include the inflation rate of the country, right? Okay, just wanted to make sure.
Yep.
And I think these
Yeah, so
numbers.
these look a lot better.
Yeah, that's
Right, right.
yeah.
Good, okay.
Oh, it's still good. China.
China?
Yeah.
Yeah, but these look much better. These still low on China, I think, but it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you look at it
Calls.
compared to UK or even to actually to the US, it's only 200-300 basis points.
Right. Right.
And Japan is, well, because of the interest rate, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I would hit it harder
Okay.
with currency and some of the other things, and like transparency and things like that.
Sure.
I didn't, because if I'm a US investor, it's still going to cost me more to move overseas to invest in Japan.
True.
So I want to make sure I'm getting paid for that, especially like on the currency side,
Okay. That makes sense.
right?
Yeah.
So part of it is, I want you to go through the process of like looking at this, but it's also some of it does become somewhat intuitive at the end, looking at the results to figure out how to get there.
That makes sense. And
There's
then
no right number.
yeah, because I think
And then I think that when I looked at it, I don't say it should be the X, there's no, it's more of a comparative.
understood. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'll keep working on this, but I just wanted to make sure I understood this.
The process,
Yeah.
right, yeah. No, I think you do, I think you do.
Okay, good. And then I think you saw my indices, but
I did, yeah.
these were the ones that I've been tracking lately.
Mhm.
That's not a loss perspective, like, you know, in one of the episodes like
有可能
he's
下次我和你咱
Those are
们
good, those are very good.
he's
So
in
I
this
would,
fucking
is there
bed.
another page?
This was just
And
the
he's
one from
talking
2
to,
weeks
like,
ago,
that
so I was
means-
actually just
That
comparing
has
the
been
Okay,
numbers.
so I would
Those boxers brushing.
add to this things like maybe, it depends what you're looking to do.
Sure.
But
But that's
consumer
that's
sentiment,
provoking
a
if you
manufacturing
like,
index,
say
or
it's
permits,
all
or
dramatized.
some other, like, take a look at, so, like, I did it here, and I think another class I put a couple of
I think we got a new listing in
我给你发
Noises.
发
So take a look at some of those,
Yeah,
for clues about, again,
It's actually really
keep
明
them
天吧
the
就把这个给
forefront
看了
question of,
明
I
天
need this to help me to figure out the investment decisions.
Okay.
就是
And
这
then
个
what
是
is
那
the
个
six
2019
help
年
me
的
Someone on
to
living
figure
history.
out what I
是
should
18年出的一个
What is
Some
the
mango.
I was supposed to make everyone give me $10.
基本的信息
I figured.
然后我
maybe
再
I'd
把
get in trouble.
我再把这些中文的
And so to
给
build up from there,
Those are good, right?
so my thought was, because I felt like
其实
I
我觉
didn't
得这
quite
个真的不错
understand all of this yet.
Mhm.
So I thought, if everyone gave me $10,
直接有一个
or just put into a bucket here.
一个 regional 的
And then I said, okay,
这不就有
you guys now have to figure out how to where to invest. So we'd have $110. Where would you be investing that $110? How would you start to figure out how to invest that $110 and build it up from there? I was going to just like do the class of that today, and maybe I should still do this. We'll see. Some time. Because I think if I push you to think about it, I know you all know what the answers are. It's just making you go through the process. Like, what do you think? Okay, so let's say I did that. You all gave me $10. And I said, okay, you have the world. And you're going to have to start to make decisions about where to invest the $10. The $110, excuse me. Because now you have a pool, you have a private fund. So, we're good?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep,
So
thank you.
we have, so we have $110 now. And we have to start thinking about where to invest the $110. What are some, how do we start to do this now?
We're obviously we're gonna first assume that we're CalPERS to see what kind of
Yeah, you're
returns we
CalPERS,
need and,
yes.
and
Okay, so let's say we
whatnot.
know we're trying to get, I don't know, let's say an 8% total return unleveraged.
Well, first
So we can do leverage.
probably want to look at the countries that were like pick a handful of countries we think we're interested in investing in first.
But
and
how
look-
do you even pick those handful of countries?
There's a billion different like aspects we're gonna look at, but start looking at
T-bond
things like
spreads, treasury bond spreads, and maybe even start with the credit rating of the country itself. to
what's
start.
what's
But you have to, but you're sitting in the US
what cities are going.
and you have a global mandate. Let's do this. Let's see.
Sounds-
I'll do this.
Right, just get it in the middle.
Okay, I won't do this. Thank you. Okay, let's do this. This is gonna be more interesting than Mexico. Alright, there's $110 sitting in the middle of this room. You have a mandate to invest globally. You have the world. What's one of the first things you're going to do to start to narrow down where you're going to invest? I'll write down what you guys tell me. Brenda?
I think countries that have like economic growth, like economic growth.
So what are we going to look at? How are we going to determine what economic growth looks like?
GDP.
I would think at the growth of the middle class. I mean,
But we need, okay. Fine, okay. So we want to look for,
and we're looking for real estate investments, right?
yes, we're looking to do real estate investing in the world.
So I think what I said before, I would start looking at a list of where it's had GDP growth.
Okay, so
the
GDP,
rapid
and why are we looking at GDP? Somebody else. Why are we looking at GDP?
Overall production of the country. It's a good economic. I mean,
It
So-
tells us what?
Biggest markets.
Right, so we want to say, we want to move into just large markets. Why?
Liquidity.
Good, what else?
Transparency.
Okay, so there's opportunity. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do, and we're gonna get to Brenda's point, we're going to look at the size of the markets. Right, does that make sense? Okay, what else? Now Brenda's saying we should look at the middle class growth. How are we going to determine middle class growth?
Employment.
Demographics,
Right, but what in demographics?
income.
Thank you, bingo. So income, we'll look at income levels. Right, so what are we doing? We're first looking at the macroeconomics of the countries. We're gonna do a comparison around the world and look at the largest countries and look at where there is significant capital already, and then where there's opportunity for growth, because we're watching the middle income, so we're looking at all of that. What else are we going to look at?
You look at housing deficit?
Well, if we wanna do housing, sure. But before we get down to that.
The real estate market is mature, REITs or.
REITs, thank you. So we're going to see if there's a public market, right? Is there a public marketplace? And why? Because we want to know that there's money flowing in and out. And it means that there's also more government oversight and regulations and such. So that gives us comfort that maybe also the market could buy us out, or we can become a REIT. We did that in Japan, actually. We bought a whole bunch of industrial buildings and we ultimately became a REIT, a publicly traded REIT. What's it called? I forgot. Anyway, so you can do that. So that's important, right? So we're starting with these macroeconomic, big picture things. What else?
Debt of the country. The debt of the country.
The debt, right, of course, right. Once the health of the country. So we want to look at some of the indicators for the country itself in terms of how is it doing. So the amount of debt, or if you look at Japan and we want to look at comparisons of the amount of debt compared to GDP growth and stuff. So we're going to look around and see how is that country doing economically. What else?
Currency.
Good, okay.
Something related to economic, inflation rate. For example, in Brazil has a very is a pretty high GDP growth, but it also has a very high inflation rate.
Yes.
So yeah.
Inflation. Good. Excellent. Yeah. Right.
Interest rates?
Yes. Very good. All right. So what are we getting now? We're getting a real picture of what's happening in this country, and we could chart this. It's what you guys just did. Right? It's these comparisons of these countries, and you looked at. I mean, we were building up. I'm taking it a little bit differently now. I'm just showing you like how would you start to even like just look at all this. So you compare the different countries. So you could start to say, okay, I'm only going to invest in countries with GDP of X, and then you can go through and say, okay, there's maybe 12 countries that really fit into that category, and then you start to narrow things down. And you're looking at the inflation, currency movements, all of this to see, okay, also the treasury rates, what's happening with the central bank, all of that, right? So you're getting a big macroeconomic picture of what's happening in the world. And then, once we have that, And then we're looking at, like as Brenda said, the middle class growth and all of that kind of shifts and opportunities, like remember how we just classified the different countries, how JLL did that? So you're going to look at things like that, say, okay, let's pull out some of those that maybe could be really interesting for us. Do they meet the criteria that we've set for the size and debt levels and treasury rates and all that for the countries? And then we're going to start to look at what?
Employment.
Yeah, well, that's part of the macro. But after we've done all the macro for the economics, then where are we going to move to?
Real estate appreciation?
Well, just real estate market, right? So have the macro view. We've narrowed our countries down to, let's say, 7 countries, and now we're going to look at the real estate markets of those 7 countries. What do we want to know about the real estate markets of those countries?
Returns.
Ultimately, yes. What else?
Supply.
Thank you. The inventory. The size of the markets. Because, I don't know, do we want to be a first mover in some of them? Maybe we do, I don't know, but let's say we don't. Do we want to be a first mover in any of these countries? So we want to look at the supply of the market. What else do we want to look at? Demand, right? So what would that, so the absorption and vacancy, right? How much space is also what else that comes into that equation? There's 3 parts of that equation. There's vacancy, absorption, and what?
New development.
Thank you, and development. Because we see huge spikes of development, even though we could see huge amounts of absorption and low vacancy, but then this is huge amount of development coming. No, thank you. Right? So now we're starting to get a picture of the real estate market. What else do we need to know about the real estate market?
We kind of talked about it before, but more specifically to the real estate market would be the transaction volume, liquidity. Like there might be typically a liquid market, but at a very low liquidity, part of the cycle.
Exactly. So those are things I was looking at before, right? How much investment? Where's the investment coming from? Is it domestic capital? Is it foreign capital? What's driving that capital? What kind of returns is that capital looking for? How much, what did I call it? Dry powder? How much capital is out there in the marketplace that needs to get placed, right? That we have to compete with. Remember, we're competing with domestic capital. They have a very different profile than us. So they can afford to do a lot more than we can by several hundred basis points typically, just the currency alone. All right, so now we're starting to get the picture of, and also what about the tenants? We don't talk about tenants enough. The occupancy, right? Who are these tenants? What kind of credit tenants? Are they all WeWork tenants? Who are they? So does that all make sense? All right, so give me back your money. And hopefully a return on and of it. And, but now you have a view of country, what's happening in the country. Then you have a view of what's happening in the real estate market and what your opportunity looks like relative to leasing it and selling it and buying it and what you can expect. That's all the stuff we just did today with those slides. Really was. All right, so now we can look at Mexico. They never had markers in this. Okay, so Oops. Okay. So we did, this was done in 2015, I think we did this. This was for a European pension fund who was thinking of investing into Mexico. Okay? And we had to essentially lay out what was happening. This is the same question I just sort of posed to you and what you're doing now for your assignment, your midterm assignment.
Is this posted? No.
No, I can't because it was a client thing, so, sorry. But you can take some notes and whatever. And just, you know what, just like sit back and just like absorb it. It's all logic. It's all very logical. Okay? So we said, what are the drivers for this country? And geography happens to be one of the biggest drivers because of the location to the US. And that's really what drives a lot of Mexico. The demographics, I think at that time, I think it was about 45% or something like that of the country is less than 25 years old. Like, wow. So that was interesting. And then also what's happening with the country and the strategy that's going about. So, yeah, okay. This was one of the most key striking things. So this is looking at from a industrial perspective, how to move goods and services. Because Mexico had lost a lot of their industry to China. But look at this. So for a 40-foot container to transport manufacture, you know, they make a lot of what's called white goods, so the refrigerators and stoves and dishwashers and washing machines and things. So Shanghai to Chicago is 5 to 6 weeks takes and costs $7,200 versus that same container to Chicago to my Spanish is not in existence. Querétaro, 3 to 5 days and $2,800. It's like, what are you even thinking about? Okay, so that was one of the first, like, real major points. Again, it's the location, it's the geography of the country that is very compelling. So, there are groups that say that Mexico is going to be, you know, one of the top contenders in the world in terms of a growth for an economic powerhouse. Because again, a lot of it having to do with the geography of the location of where it is. So you can find studies that sort of demonstrate all of that. Now, whether you believe it or not, it's, you know, it's up to you. But the point is that there seems to be a lot of very good support to demonstrate that Mexico has a lot of good opportunities coming down the road. Now, politics has now created a lot of noise. And I'll tell you what the investor ultimately decided at the end, but maybe we'll take a poll and see what you guys decide after listening to all of this. So here it is, 48% of the population is under 25. It's just striking when you know, think about Japan and such. 27 million new households per year before the next 25 years. So think about that in terms of retail, what I just said about the white goods and what's needed, you know, to form all of these households. It's striking. Strong sustained demand for housing, durable goods, services, and the need to create 1.3 million jobs per year over the next 25 years. So again, there's this huge growth engine that's happening there that is quite significant. And you can see a nice population growth as opposed to the opposite in some of these other countries we've been looking at in the shift in 2010 to 2014. Plus, you have a good distribution of male-female, which is also important. So just what we just said. So the demographics here are supporting the growth of the country. So we looked at the geography, we're looking at the demographics. So, and then we also look at the fact that the demographics are going to create the economic need by this push of creating all these households and all these new jobs over the next 25 years. The economic activity that's been growing has impacted the household wealth, so there's more distribution of income that's being used for consumers to be able to then support the economy's growth as well. The closest of the labor pool to the US attracted lots of manufacturers over there, so you can see that there has been a pool of companies that have moved over there. In NAFTA, so you saw what, I mean now, again, this was 2015 before all this noise, so you had something like NAFTA that was creating a lot of opportunities for Mexico in manufacturing, and it spilled into other parts of the country as well. Tourism, also a very big part of this story. And then also structural reforms, they were looking to do a lot of infrastructure. Mexico City has a very big problem with pollution, and they were looking at ways of dealing with that. But you can start to see that this whole demographic shift is leaking into the economy in terms of creating opportunities and growth and competitiveness. And that translated into growth in the real estate marketplace. So here, like what we just spoke about, on one chart, you start to see all the different pieces of the puzzle. So you have the economy, the GDP, the population, what you're saying, Brenda, a little bit about middle class growth, and then you look at all these different marketplaces, and you look at the size of the sectors, the change in them, how do the compounded annual growth rates in those particular markets, and the actual inventory, I guess, the shift of what they're expecting. So if you look at the economy, that shift, that change, that delta is 156% growth between now and 2040. Now again, you have to see whether or not you believe all of that and whatever, but point is they're looking at some very significant growth in the economy that's filtering down into primarily what? Primarily the industrial marketplace. Look at the shift in growth there, but also the office space as well, and also the hotel marketplace and the housing and retail. So it's in everything. So the point is that you can start to draw the conclusion that this shift in demographics and because of the geography are filtering into opportunities in all of these different sectors.
One question.
Sure.
So when population doesn't match that growth, does that mean there's an opportunity because either the market's not supplying enough for the population, or is it because the population might not be growing?
So we had a chart 2 weeks ago that looked at different parts of the world and the different in terms of residential and the population and then the inventory. So when there's an imbalance, which is exactly what you're talking about, Jessica, it's that's an opportunity potentially, or the flip of it, that it's run the other way.
Okay.
So it will tell you whether or not if there's too much inventory compared to the population or there's not enough. And that will stage you to either do development or not do development or just run the other way.
Okay.
Okay, so now we also want to look at it, again, it's never just an absolute, it's always on a relative basis that we want to look at where things lie. So right now, we're looking at Mexico as number 15 in terms of a GDP strength versus where we're expecting it to go up to number 11. So the point is there are points of demonstrative optimism that this is a growing country. But so do you see how in a matter of just a few pages, we've gotten into a pretty cohesive story gives a good visual of what's happening. Something we haven't spoken about a lot, but import-export clearly to a place like Mexico, very, very important. And something if you want to put into your indices, you can, add to that, because that's a very telling tale. And now, with everything that's happening with the tariffs and everything, it's quite interesting to sort of follow, see what's going to happen with that. So, where this was also, I was shocked about this. Look at the pie chart on the left. Services, 59% of the economy. Whereas I would have thought that would have been the manufacturing piece. So that to me was a good indicator too, where the country is currently in its maturation. And non-oil exports also gave us a comfort level. That's not just because everything's changing with the whole oil industry or energy industry. So
again, what is Mexico's major cash cow like? What is Mexico's cash crop? I mean,
well, so the point is, look what this is telling you, Hash.
It's services.
Right.
Okay.
So it's not the corn or whatever you might think in an agricultural basis.
Right.
It's services like here. It's not even manufacturing, it's services.
So okay. I mean, that can let me say that they're not as. I mean the land is not as fertile. Can I think of it that way?
No, not necessarily. No, in fact, I would argue it's just that it's a much more mature economy than you think it is.
Wouldn't also beg like a deeper dive into it, because you could probably have two countries that have similar service numbers, but one of them is financial services and law, and the other one could be
This is
retail.
hotels.
That's what I mean, hotels, retail workers.
It's tourism. But it's still surprising and warrants further investigation to understand where it is. But it's like, we all came to this with a preconception that it was agricultural. And it's like, that's not the answer here. So that's also why, again, we think we know everything, right? So, but that was also quite interesting. And also, the fact that the domestic market is as strong as it is to us was also a very good symbol. That they're not dependent upon the U.S. specifically. So they can say, we're not going to build your wall. That much damage. So economic activity led by export manufacturing. So that's really the answer, is it is manufacturing and export, but on a total basis, it's this, I think it's the service industry and hotels. So exports represented 31% of GDP and 87% went to the US. So maybe they will put a few bricks up. But the point is, again, getting a very clear picture here of what's going on and what the risks and the weaknesses are, as well as the strengths. Here's historical GDP. So what would be interesting too is to map this against the US, right? So what's the saying, when the US sneezes, does so-and-so catch a cold? Right? So that's the question here. Right, Victor?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the different. Oh, so one of the issues has been, or the fear, has been security in Mexico, or the lack of security. And I mean physical, personal security. And so, and we worked with this, by the way, with some our colleagues from Mexico City. And so they're very sensitive about this. And they wanted to make the point that it's not as scary or as dangerous as what you might read in the newspaper. So we felt it was important to compare that. Also, it's the same thing like we said before. So you have 8 states, 75 states with low to medium, all right. No, it's not on this chart. Okay, never mind. Okay, so services versus industrial versus private consumption and change in main industries, and so you're looking at what kind of companies are there and making up the GDP and what's contributing to it. So here's sort of a summary of everything that we've just been talking about, a bullet point of the geography and demographics, the structural reforms. We didn't talk about that much, but it's there. The population, expansion of industrial activity, and the growth of the service sector, and the drivers that show long-term stability, which is essentially saying it's all poised for growth. We had good analysts who like to play with this stuff. Sorry. Oops. Okay. So this is just sort of a flow chart that showed what we were saying before. And so here are the results, right? So we're tying the macro into the different sector plays and the job growth. So it's ultimately it's 2 things: it's jobs and consumption. That's what you want to say. Okay, so now, we demonstrated that here's what's happening on the macro side, here's how we relate it to real estate, and here's why. And now we want to look at, well, so what's some of the infrastructure things? So we want to look at rail, in terms of, especially if you're looking at doing industrial, thank you. So we want to look at what is the infrastructure for rail throughout the country. Is it significant enough? Energy reform, in terms of what's happening in different parts of, because part of it wasn't enough distribution of energy to a lot of these different places. So again, you'd be very limited in terms of where you could actually invest because of such things. So that's why you would look at a lot of the infrastructure in a place like Mexico to make sure that where you were targeting had all of the appropriate infrastructure, because otherwise it's a huge investment and you never know how long. Like in Brazil, they kept saying they were going to be building all this these roadworks, and for years and years they kept saying the same thing, and it just didn't happen. So you want to make sure that that's a commitment that's going to happen.
Is it like blackouts too?
Mexico, well, like Guam has that. Like a lot of places have that. So you have to. I don't know if Mexico does, to be honest, but you have to be careful. So the national economy on Mexico City's economy. So you want to look at, now we're targeting Mexico City as a target for investment. So how is the macroeconomic and national or federal level impacting the local economy? And so you have new automobile manufacturing, clustering in some regions, you have aerospace industry, the oil industry was opening up to foreign investment. You had, at that time, along the US border, this industry that was growing up for manufacturing, that was moving actually out of China and back to this part of the world. And the federal government itself was in Mexico City, so that was a good thing. And so you have corporate and financial activity that's happening directly in Mexico City. So you can look at what's happening in the country overall and see how it's impacting a particular region that you're targeting. Now we want to look at where the different sectors are within real estate, in the marketplace, in Mexico. And again, you start to see, some clustering, although there's some outliers as well, like Tijuana and such. But for the most part, you look at the whole Mexico City corridor, and that's really where all the diversity is. Although you have also, like, if you're interested in industrial, you have some of these three different towns that are like just industrial towns. So you could use that as an opportunity where to be investing. And what actually is motivating all of that? There were new shopping centers being built over the past decade. Increased consumption. We saw that the household growth is going to come. There's growth of the office sector in renewing the city CBD, which is also has a demand for higher quality housing that goes along with office as well. And you have corporate activities that are starting to take off with much higher paying jobs. So that's the other thing you should be looking at. I don't think we included it here, but per capita income, what that looks like, and how that impacts all that. So FIBRAs are the Mexican version of REITs, essentially. And so there is that marketplace that exists. What's interesting in terms of the ownership in Mexico is that it's been, the real estate market has been primarily in the hands of a handful of families. And they have not wanted to sell, typically. And so it's a very closed marketplace and very difficult to break into. And if you're not from there, I mean, you can't just go in and just start buying things up. You have to have relationships. You need local partners. You have to do it in a way that's mindful of the marketplace. But it's not easy, is the point. But the good news is that if you look at this, the FIBRA issue has raised more than $4 billion during 2014. So that's a pretty good sign of a maturing marketplace. So cap rates finally rebounded in 2013. And there's a scarcity of product, as I'm saying. It's not an overly traded investment marketplace. So that scarcity is going to impact returns, obviously. So traditional lenders for real estate have been GE and MetLife, which was quite interesting. But now I think that's a whole different thing. More local commercial banks have taken over, and there have been some global players in this real estate market, but not so many, is what I would say at this point in time. So again, I think a lot of it has to do because it's such a closed, controlled marketplace with not a lot of product coming on the market at any one time. So the opportunity was pretty limited, and even if you tried to partner with some of these families, it was not really a welcome thing. So here these are the different REITs essentially. So you do see some global names like Prologis and Macquarie's. But most of the others are local Mexican, homegrown names. Another thing to be thinking about, and you guys should be thinking about, is how is it that you get to own real estate in a foreign market, in any marketplace, right? So there are sometimes rules and regulations for foreign ownership in a marketplace. You should understand how land is transferred in a marketplace. Taxes and registration and things of that nature. Tenancy. We've spoken about some unusual kinds of tenant leases in some of these markets. Some are very long-term, some are shorter term. Some of them I mentioned, like in Korea, have been used for financing, where tenants have to pay their entire rent day one. So you need to understand if there's some strange or different say strange, but different kind of practice that's done in that marketplace relative to leases and tenants and leasing and such. And then if there's just anything else that you can find, I wouldn't go crazy looking for this, it's a little, might be too difficult to find, but, you know, are there certain restricted areas where foreigners can't buy? Things like that. And transferring. Oh, well, that's important. You might have extra taxes. I don't expect you to know this for your, but if you do, it's fine. But understanding, again, if you're competing with domestic capital and you are charged some extra tax because you are a foreign capital source, that's going to have an impact on moving into that country. And then who is responsible for which taxes? So, and here how assets are sold. Like, so what do you do when you go, and we discussed this, I think, you know, when you first walk into a marketplace, what do you start to do? How do you find what, you know, and we said, go to lawyers, accountants, different types of groups like that to get recommendations, because there are global consultants that you know are reputable that can introduce you to different types of sources of real estate groups that might be looking for capital. And are there auction processes? What is the process of selling and buying a building in these markets? Is it by auction? Is it just, you know, is it a brokerage community? Does it have to be listed in the local paper? You know, how is that? How does that work? So here's what we're saying here. Here, both investor groups prefer to hold their assets rather than recycling them for short-term profit. So this makes this very difficult. So if you think about the opportunity, it's probably more development-driven as opposed to existing brownfield kinds of assets. If you have because if you're saying, well, there's all this opportunity for growth here from the demographics, but there's not a lot that's traded because they like the income, and yet there's movement for more maybe industrial buildings because of the manufacturing that's taking place, then that might be the opportunity. And here, this we just put down, you know, what you want for your operating partner in terms of their characteristics. Because that's the other thing, we haven't discussed this, you do have to underwrite your partner. And how do you do that in a foreign country where you don't know anyone, pretty much? It's pretty difficult. What would you start to do?
I'd start by finding someone I can trust. So that, like, for example, for me personally, I would know someone at CBRE who would know people there, would ask me to make a recommendation to someone local, and then when you go meet that person locally, you have that kind of intermediary from back home.
So through a relationship.
And then from there, you could ask them, do you know anybody local you could introduce me, and that gives you more credibility with them, and likewise, they're probably going to want to recommend someone.
Okay, so that's how you found them, but now how do you underwrite them?
I think their track record will say a lot, especially in terms of.
So you think that these guys they're going to open their books to you?
No, but.
Is there anyone you worked with that we could speak to?
But the point is,
I mean, the banks. I'm sure the banks would talk to you about.
Well, that's their
maybe,
clients.
maybe not. Yeah.
You know, a lot of the times they want the new capital, so it's kind of like a partnership. So you come in, especially from the U.S. or from other countries, they come in with the capital and they are willing to open their books so they can work with you, because what those countries lack, it's capital.
Right.
You know?
So that's a good point. It's an excellent point. But like we have here, retailers. If you ever oversee like a mall, so they always say the retailers have 3 sets of books. the real ones, what they show the landlords, and then what they show the government.
Oh, in Latin America.
Right. So this is right. Right.
But
I
I
was
guess-
using the U.S. as an example,
Yeah.
but yes.
I
so,
guess at that point you would do what you taught us, like you have to add a certain, amount
Right.
to the return that you're expecting to get for the risk that you're willing
Exactly.
to take. Right?
And then it's also maybe you hire an auditor. And if they're willing to open the books, because they want the capital, you'll get something. It might not be perfect, but you'll get something. And then you go around and you find out who else have they partnered with. Or speaking to the banks, or speaking to their clients. How people treat their clients is very telling as well. So, and finding other employees that are there. Or maybe an employee who's left, if you can find them. So, you need to plant yourself there and do a lot of work, a lot of legwork. And it's, but it's not easy. I think I told you this with both Morgan Stanley and no, it was Goldman Sachs, sorry. It was Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, I think. Both got taken to the cleaners by same Chinese couple in China and had to go home. Lost a lot.
Yeah.
And just it happens. Well, anyway. So this is just some stats. So this is a nice quick little view of Mexico City and the metro area. So you see we went from the major down to the smaller. Population, all that kind of good. Our higher institutions, how many people are college graduates, all of that kind of thing. And then what we did for Mexico itself, then we did for Mexico City. And the growth. So these double-digit numbers. Municipalities. So, looking at just the opportunity set within in Mexico City in terms of their economy. So the service sector is the largest component of the economy, accounting for 89% of total GDP for Mexico City. Now, okay, and then there were 3 cities that had just total industrial marketplace. So it's bifurcated. It's really split up. So here you can see the business and finance is 33%, trade and tourism 20%. Manufacturing, transportation, but again, some surprises along the way. Yeah, but the service sector is 81% of the cities. And then looking at the density of the different sectors, the real estate sectors, office, retail, logistics. And then more kind of fiscal kind of planning of what's coming down the pike. Now, I'm not asking you to go to the planning departments of, whatever town you're looking at, but you can just make a comment about it or something, because that's so critical in terms of what's coming up in terms of new construction and such. And also just, is the government friendly towards, also what's happening with voting? Is there an election coming up? Are there unions, that kind of, corporate friendliness versus not unfriendly. And what the regulations are, if you're thinking of development, what kind of zoning and all that kind of thing, how hard is that to get changed? And the infrastructure for the city. then we just started to break it down into, that was the other interesting thing in terms of, I mean, if you're going to do office, there was just no choice. You had to do Mexico City, and that was it. And this was the development piece. So we were able to get that. And then who are the owners? And this is where you can really see it's all very local kind of ownership. And small. I mean, there was like a handful of larger groups, but there's a lot of little players. And just where it would be. And Mark was gonna say, oops. Wait, I'm going backwards, sorry. And then we went into sub-markets as well. And who are the tenants? Then we went into the tenants, start the puzzle. Leasing, so this is what we were talking about before, the absorption, the construction, this is exactly what we said before. What we said before, now you see live. And here, I love, this is the best chart. So it shows you absorption, supply, and vacancy in one chart. And it starts to tell you and projects into the future for you. Rents. So, cap rates over a period of time. Where are we? And then some of the submarkets. And again, I'm not asking you to do all of this, no way. But I'm just showing you what it looks like. You've got a very good picture within a few minutes of what's happening, and then this what goes into all the details. This was a favorite one, the little cards and chips and things. So, and where that's all happening. Do supply, logistics, and so you did office, industrial, capital values, and retail. Again, it's like not even where you go. So you're doing the same analysis over and over again, just slicing and dicing for the different markets. And then the residential. So this was at the end. The conclusion was there's going to be long-term growth. There are lots of opportunities for developers. We put developers first for a reason. Investors, brokers, and other service providers. The real estate markets will continue to become more institutional. The infrastructure is opening up new areas for development, and there should be some high growth corridors. But you need to have the relationships to be able to implement it. So, you are a European pension plan. Would you invest here?
When was this?
This was 2015.
I'd wait till Trump comes on.
Wait for the downturn?
No, I'd wait till Trump comes on.
Oh, but we had no idea. I mean,
No, 2016. I mean, he was running already.
Yeah, it's like that.
I mean, he was at least like the face of something.
I guess.
It was still a long shot at that point.
Yeah, like nobody took it seriously. That's the point, I guess. Nobody took it seriously.
I thought you said in one of the slides it said that most of that consumption is internal,
I like it.
right?
Mm-hmm.
It stays within country, so even that would
Right, wouldn't have it that much of it. Although it said, I think it was 83% of the export goes to the US.
Yeah, for industrial.
Right, so it's pretty big.
Yeah.
So are we investing there or not?
Based on this,
Yeah, Mexico.
Yeah.
So.
Your European pension plan, remember. See lots of nods.
Sure.
What's happening in Europe in 2050?
Yeah, exactly.
Don't overthink. They said no.
Who said no?
They said no.
Not really.
Yeah, they were afraid.
I think
The security was one of the biggest issues for them.
That was during the peak of the cartel, was that?
No, I think
That
this
was
was after that, yeah. They were very concerned about the security, and they're very sensitive, engine plans are very sensitive about, not getting headline press about anything.
We did exactly what you recommended. In 2015, we invested in Quattro, and then we also invested in Juarez. Juarez was a bad decision because of security, so
Oh.
we closed it down. And because even though Juarez is close to the U.S. border, it cuts down on the logistical expenditure, but you couldn't get product out because of the conditions there.
It's the
Still
infrastructure.
Juarez. That's like what you think of when you think of cartel.
Right, but so that's interesting.
Yeah, and we're continuing to invest. It's doing well.
So you see this, it's a very compelling story, I think. In terms of the numbers, you know, they make a lot of sense. But so now you're making an informed gut decision. You have the information, but then there's this underlying discomfort. And do you make that leap?
I'm surprised that they were so adverse to investing in Mexico City though, because that's a relatively safer part of the country than.
It's still, I knew people that.
Like
you
kidnappings
had-
and stuff there all the time.
You arrived at the airport and they sent a car with bulletproof windows and things. There were people walking the street, they said, do not walk in the streets.
Really, I'm actually going there in a couple months. So.
I love it there.
Yeah, no, I thought it was
great.
fine, but I understand what they see.
Right.
Yeah,
Just don't make yourself look like a target.
sure.
Yeah.
It is a risk.
Right. But it's interesting because, again, I think it's a very compelling story, but.
As you said, also it was for developers the big opportunity, not for a fund
Pension
that
fund,
is
right.
seeking already a portfolio.
Exactly. It's much
Properties.
harder. Right.
Uh,
Right, because
there
you spend a
isn't
lot
as-
of time here and come up with nothing.
And there isn't as many assets to make a healthy weighted portfolio
Right.
to even out our risks as well, I'd say, like, you know.
Exactly. But do you see how the story developed? And it's not hard, it really isn't. Just very logical. So just use your common sense. So, I don't know, I don't know how we're on time, but we covered a lot,
Yeah.
so. All right.
Do you just take this and pitch this to the next person or not?
It's a good presentation. It's like
No, we wouldn't do
becomes
that.
their property.